Chapter 6. Bells, BRICS, and Beyond. We aim at progressively developing BRICS into a full-fledged mechanism of coordination on a wide range of key issues. As the global economy is being reshaped, we are committed to exploring new models. Declaration of the BRICS, March 2013. Citizens of the Baltic countries can be grateful that their leaders never listened to Krugman. Anders Osland, September 2012. Supranational. The European Union, the United States, China, and Japan constitute a global gang of four that comprises 65% of the world's economy. The remaining 157 nations tracked by the IMF make up the other 35% of global output. Among these 157 nations is a gang of 10, consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, Canada, Australia, Mexico, Korea, Indonesia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, which each produce between 1 and 3% of global output. Each of the smallest 147 nations produces less than 1% of global output, and most produce far less. The wealth concentration among nations is as starkly skewed as it is within nations. Among the 80% of nations with the lowest output, any one could disappear tomorrow, and the impact on global growth would scarcely be noticed. This is important to recall when Wall Street analysts promote theses on investing in emerging markets, frontier markets, and more exotic locales. The fact is, there are few significant capital markets. Their capacity to absorb inflows is limited, and they have a tendency to overheat when they try to absorb more than a modest amount of capital. Yet as China heads for a hard landing, and the United States is stuck in low gear, as Japan endures its third decade in depression, and as Europe muddles through a structural adjustment, it is difficult to deny the Gang of Ten's investment appeal, and the appeal of those not far behind, such as Poland, Taiwan, South Africa, Colombia, and Thailand. Consider the BRICS. For convenience as well as for marketing purposes, analysts bundle smaller nations into groups tagged with acronyms made of members' names. BRICS, BRICS, is the granddaddy of such groups, consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and a late entry to the club, South Africa. Each BRICS member has its own attractions and problems. What the BRICS do not have is much in common. The Russian economy is best understood as a natural resource extraction racket run by oligarchs and politicians who skim enormous amounts off the top and reinvest just enough to keep the game going. China has produced real growth, but has also produced waste, pollution, and corruption, to the point that China has an unsustainable model hostile to any foreign investor from whom it cannot steal technology. India has growth and great promise, but has not come close to realizing its potential because its world-class red tape Raj stifles innovation. Among the BRICS, Brazil and South Africa come closest to being real economies in the sense that growth is sustainable, corruption is not completely rampant, and entrepreneurship has room to breathe. Yet there is no denying the success of the BRICS moniker. The original term BRIC was created by Jim O'Neill and his colleagues at Goldman Sachs in 2001 to highlight the group's share of global GDP and higher growth rates compared to established large economy groups such as the G7. But O'Neill's analysis was not primarily economic, it was political. Beyond the basic facts about size and growth, O'Neill called for rethinking the G7's international governance model to reduce Europe's role and increase the role of emerging economies in a new G5 plus BRICS equals G9 formula. In his proposed G9, O'Neill glossed over differences in social development, including bedrock principles such as civil rights and the rule of law, with the comment, "The other members would need to recognize that not all member countries need to be the same." He recognized that the BRICS were not at all homogeneous as economic models. He wrote, "The 4 countries under consideration are very different economically, socially, and politically." How O'Neill's original work morphed from a political manifesto to an investment theme is best explained by Wall Street's penchant for salespeople engaging their customers with a good story. But it's difficult to fault O'Neill for this. He had a political agenda, and it worked. By 2008, the G7 was practically a museum piece, and the G20, including the BRICS and others, was the de facto board of directors of the international monetary system. O'Neill correctly foresaw that in the post-Cold War globalized world, the economic had become the political. Economic output trumped civil society and other traditional metrics of inclusion in global leadership groups. The BRICS concept was never an investment thesis, so much as a political injunction, and the world took heed. The BRICS' success bred a host of acronomic imitators. Among the recent entrants in this naming derby are the BELS, consisting of Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the Gipps of the EU periphery, consisting of Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. As a group, the Gipps are best understood as a Eurozone subset that share the euro and are undergoing arduous internal economic adjustments. Within the Gipps, one should distinguish between Spain and Italy on the one hand, which are true economic giants making up almost 5% of the global economy, and Portugal, Ireland, and Greece on the other, whose combined output is less than 1% of global total. On the whole, the BELS and Gipps have more economic factors in common than they do the BRICS, and their proponents have explicit economic themes in mind versus the overtly political perspectives of O'Neill and Goldman Sachs. BELS. The BELS are small, almost inconsequential, as their economies add up to just 0.2% of global GDP combined. But their geopolitical significance is enormous, since they form the EU's eastern frontier and are the frontline states buffering Europe and the traditional Eastern powers, Russia and Turkey. Unlike the BRICS, the BELS do have much in common. In addition to being EU members, they had all fixed the value of their local currencies to the euro. Pegging to the euro has led the BELS into the same internal adjustment and devaluation as the Eurozone periphery, since they cannot use currency devaluation as a quick fix for dealing with economic adjustment issues. Economists lament that they cannot conduct scientific experiments on national economies because many variables cannot be controlled and processes cannot be replicated. But certain cases have enough controlled variables to produce telling results when divergent policies are pursued under similar conditions. 2 such quasi-experiments involving BELS have played out recently. The first contrasts the BELS and the Gipps. The second contrasts each BELS member to the others. Experiments are typically conducted by controlling certain variables among all participants and measuring differences in the factor that are not controlled. The first control variable in this real-world experiment is that neither the BELS nor the Gipps devalued their currencies. The BELS have maintained a local currency pegged to the euro and have not devalued. Indeed, Estonia actually joined the euro on January 1, 2011, at the height of anti-euro hysteria, and Latvia joined on January 1, 2014. The second control variable is the depth of the economic collapse in both the BELS and the Gipps beginning in 2008 and continuing into 2009. Each BEL suffered approximately a 20% decline in output in those 2 years, and unemployment reached 20%. The decline in output in the Gipps in the same period was only slightly less. The third control variable is that both the BELS and the Gipps suffered an evaporation of direct foreign investment and lost access to capital markets, a shortfall that had to be made up with various forms of official assistance. In short, the BELS and the Gipps both experienced collapsing output, rising unemployment, and a sudden stop in foreign investment in 2008 and 2009. At the same time, the governments never seriously considered devaluation, despite wails from the pundits. From these comparable initial conditions, divergent policies were pursued. The Gipps initially continued so-called economic stimulus and made only slight cuts in public spending. Greece actually increased the number of government employees between 2010 and 2011. The principal way of addressing fiscal issues in the Gipps was through tax increases. The internal adjustment process of lowering unit labor costs began in Gipps only in 2010, and serious fiscal and labor market reform was begun in 2013. Much work remains. In contrast, the Bells took immediate, drastic measures to put their fiscal houses in order, and strong growth resumed as early as 2010 and is now the highest in the EU. The turnaround was dramatic. Latvia's economy contracted 24% in 2008 to 2009, but then grew over 10% in 2011 to 2012. Estonia contracted 20% in 2008 to 2009, but grew at a robust 7.9% rate in 2011. Lithuania's economy did not suffer as much as the other Bells in the crisis and actually grew 2.8% in 2008. Lithuania's growth did decline in 2009, but it bounced back quickly and rose 5.9% in 2011. This pattern of collapse, followed by robust growth in the Baltic Bells, is the classic V pattern that is much discussed but seldom seen in recent years because governments such as the United States use money printing to truncate the V, leaving protracted, anemic growth in its wake. How does one account for this sharp turnaround in the Baltic states' growth compared to the EU periphery? Anders Åslund, a scholar at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., and an expert on the Eastern European and Russian economies, has written extensively on this topic. He attributes economic success in the Baltics and failure in Southern Europe from 2009 to 2012 to specific factors. When confronted with severe economic contraction, he suggests, an affected nation must embrace the crisis and turn it to political advantage. Political leaders who explain clearly the economic choices to their citizens will gain support for tough policies, while leaders such as those in the United States and Southern Europe, who deny the problem's depth, will find that the sense of urgency recedes and that citizens are less willing over time to make needed sacrifices. Åslund also urges that countries facing economic crises should embrace new leaders with new ideas. Vested interests associated with old leadership will be most likely to cling to failed policies, while new leaders are able to pursue the cuts in government spending needed to restore fiscal health. Åslund also recommends that the emergency economic responses be clearly communicated, front-loaded, and weighted more to spending cuts than tax increases. Citizens will support policies they understand, but will be ambivalent about the need for spending cuts if politicians sugarcoat the situation and prolong the process. He also says that credible culprits are useful. In Latvia's case, 3 oligarchs dominated the economy in 2006, and 51% of the seats in parliament were held by parties they controlled. Reform politicians campaigned against their corruption, and by 2011 the oligarchs' representation had shrunk to 13%. The United States also had corrupt bankers as ready-made culprits, but chose to bail them out rather than hold them accountable for the pre-crisis excesses. Finally, and most important, Åslund emphasizes that the restructuring process must be equitable and take the form of a social compact. All societal sectors, government and non-government, union and non-union, must sacrifice to restore vigor to the economy. With regard to Latvia, he writes, "The government prohibited double incomes for senior civil servants and cut salaries of top officials more than of junior public employees, with 35% salary cuts for ministers." Again, the process in the Baltics contrasts sharply with that of countries such as the United States, where government spending has increased since the crisis. In the United States, public union and government employee salaries and benefits have mostly been protected, while the brunt of adjustment has fallen on the non-union private sector. Åslund concludes by noting that these recommendations were mostly followed in the Baltics and disregarded in the southern periphery, with the result that the Baltics are now growing robustly, while Europe's southern periphery is stuck in recession, with uncertain prospects. The BEL's success in quickly restoring growth and competitiveness contrasts sharply with the Gipps, which have stretched the process out over 6 years and still have a considerable way to go to achieve fiscal sustainability. Reports from the Baltic region are overwhelmingly positive on the economies there. Reporting on Estonia in 2012, CNBC's Paul Ames writes, "Shoppers throng Nordic design shops and cool new restaurants in Tallinn, the medieval capital, and cutting-edge tech firms complain they can't find people to fill their job vacancies." The BELs have also made good use of their human capital and a relatively well-educated workforce. Estonia in particular has become a high-tech hub centered on its most successful company, Skype, which has more than 400 employees in a worker-friendly campus near Tallinn. The New York Times published a story on Latvia in 2013 that accurately captured the trajectory of steep collapse and strong recovery that used to be typical of business cycles, but is now mostly avoided by Western governments at the expense of long-term growth. They wrote, "When a credit-fueled economic boom turned to bust in this tiny Baltic nation in 2008, Didsis Krummans, who ran a small architectural company, fired his staff and then shut down the business. He watched in dismay as Latvia's misery deepened under a harsh austerity drive that scythed wages, jobs, and state financing for schools and hospitals. But instead of taking to the streets to protest the cuts, Mr. Krummans bought a tractor and began hauling wood to heating plants that needed fuel. Then, as Latvia's economy began to pull out of its nosedive, he returned to architecture and today employs 15 people, 5 more than he had before." Even the IMF, which has generally counseled against the sharp government spending cutbacks used in Baltic states, acknowledged the Baltic success in a 2013 speech by its managing director, Christine Lagarde, in Riga. She said, "While challenges remain today, you have pulled through. You have returned to strong growth and reduced unemployment. You have lowered budget deficits and kept government debt ratios to some of the lowest in the European Union. You have become more competitive in world markets through wage and price cuts. You have restored confidence and brought down interest rates through good macroeconomic policies. We are here today to celebrate your achievements." The peg to the euro, and, in the Estonian and Latvian cases, actual conversion to the euro, have proved instrumental in the recovery and growth stories in the BELs. Anchoring a local currency to the euro, and ultimately adopting it, removes exchange rate uncertainty for trading partners, investors, and lenders. The benefits of offering economic certainty were illustrated in a recent Bloomberg report. It read in part, "Today, Estonia's economy is the fastest growing in the currency bloc. Consumers and businesses are paying lower interest rates, and businesses tied with Finland, a Euro member state and Estonia's main trading partner, are tighter than ever. The most important thing was that we ended all of the speculation about a possible devaluation of the kroon," says Preet Parens, the chief executive officer of Swedbank AS, Estonia's biggest lender and part of Stockholm-based Swedbank. Fears that all the Baltic countries would eventually devalue had hampered the investor confidence for a long time. Devaluation would have been ruinous, since Estonia's banks had started lending in euros before the country switched to the common currency. Paying off euro-denominated loans in devalued kroon would have imposed a crushing burden on businesses and consumers. Lithuania and Bulgaria constitute an experiment within an experiment, since they have not pursued fiscal consolidation as strenuously as Latvia and Estonia, and as a result have not recovered as robustly. But overall, the BELs have implemented fiscal consolidation and other reforms far more rigorously than have the Gipps, and they are achieving sustainable debt and deficit levels, trade surpluses, and improved credit ratings as a reward. If not a perfectly controlled experiment, the contrast between the BELs and the Gipps policy choices is a powerful case study. The findings show that economic prudence works and Keynesian-style stimulus fails. The results are not surprising, given Keynesianism's dismal track record over the decades and the lack of empirical support for its claims. But the bells example is likely to resonate for decades among objective observers who look for empirical economic proof as opposed to classroom hypotheticals. The cases of the bells and the Gipps illustrate both the benefits of fiscal consolidation, as practiced by the former, and the costs of delay and denial, as practiced by the latter. The overriding lesson is that currency devaluation is not a precondition to recovery, but rather a hindrance. A strong, stable currency is a magnet for investment and a catalyst for expanded trade. The essential ingredients for rapid growth following a crisis are accountability, transparency, fiscal consolidation, and an equitable distribution of sacrifices. The Bell's experience from 2008 to 2014 offers powerful lessons for Europe's southern periphery as it continues to adjust in the years ahead. BRICS. While the Bells were breaking new ground and demonstrating fiscal consolidation's benefits, the more powerful BRICS have unsettled conventional wisdom and cast doubt on the U.S. dollar's future as the world's leading reserve currency. When the BRICS leaders convened a finance ministers' summit in September 2006 in New York City, they showed every sign of evolving in line with O'Neill's original prescription, not so much as a coherent economic bloc, but as a political force. The meetings evolved into a formal leaders' summit in Yekaterinburg, Russia in June 2009, and the summits have continued at the ministerial and leaders level. In 2010, the original BRIC group of Brazil, Russia, India, and China invited South Africa to join its ranks, and the acronym was changed to BRICS. In April 2011, South Africa attended its first BRICS Leaders Summit as a full member in Sanya, China. O'Neill has consistently downplayed the idea that South Africa should be among the BRICS, because the size of its economy and population, coupled with its unemployment problem, do not put it in the first rank of developing economies. This is true economically, but, ironically, South Africa's addition vindicates O'Neill's original thesis that the BRIC project was more political than economic. The other BRICS were located in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The African continent was a conspicuous gap in the alignment of the East and South against the West. South Africa, as the largest economy in Africa, filled that gap with its advanced infrastructure and highly educated workers, despite its relatively small size. The BRICS' combined economic heft is undeniable. The members represent over 40% of global population, 20% of global economic output, and 40% of total foreign exchange reserves. The BRICS have emerged as a counterweight to the original G7 of highly developed economies and a powerful caucus within the more inclusive G20. However, the BRICS have not taken any measures to integrate their economies into a free trading area or EU-style currency union, except on a limited, bilateral basis. The BRICS' principal impact has been to weigh in on global governance and the future of the international monetary system, with one voice. The BRICS leaders have begun to stake out radical new positions on 5 key issues: IMF voting, UN voting, multilateral assistance, development assistance, and global reserve composition. Their manifesto calls for nothing less than a rethinking or overturning of the post-Second World War arrangements made at Bretton Woods and San Francisco that led to the original forms of the IMF, World Bank, and the United Nations. The BRICS insist that unless those institutions are reformed to be more inclusive of BRICS priorities, the BRICS will take concrete steps to create their own institutions to perform their functions on a regional basis. The evolution of such institutions would inevitably entail a diminution in the role of the institutions they were meant to replace. It's unclear whether these proposals are a stalking horse to promote real reform in the existing forums, or whether they are concrete plans to proceed in the direction announced. Perhaps both intentions are true. In any case, the BRICS are unwilling to accept international monetary and governance status quo. Specifically, the BRICS have called for expansion of the UN Security Council permanent members to include Brazil and India. Russia and China are already permanent members. This would create a 7-member permanent membership with the BRICS holding 4 seats, a slight majority. There would be no elimination of the U.S. veto in this scenario, but the addition of a Brazilian or Indian veto would significantly increase BRICS' leverage in the behind-the-scenes negotiations that precede formal Security Council votes. Inclusion of Brazil and India would increase the occasions on which BRICS hold the rotating Security Council presidency. The Security Council presidency gives the presiding nation the ability to set the agenda and affect Security Council processes. The BRICS, especially China, have also pushed for voting reform at the IMF. If population, reserves, and economic output are the relevant criteria, then current voting power in the IMF is skewed in Western Europe's favor and against the BRICS. The IMF leadership recognizes this, and Managing Director Christine Lagarde has been outspoken in favor of needing voting reforms, called voice in IMF jargon, especially with regard to China. The difficulty lies in getting countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands to reduce their voice in favor of China. This process has dragged on for years. The BRICS have played their cards astutely by conditioning BRICS pledges for badly needed IMF lending facilities to progress on voting reform. The BRICS trump card in this game is to launch an alternative multilateral reserve lending institution if the IMF does not increase their voting power. A blueprint for BRICS alternatives to the IMF and World Bank was a principal result of their March 2013 summit in Durban, South Africa. At that summit's conclusion, the BRICS issued a communiqué which stated in part, "We directed our finance ministers to examine the feasibility and viability of setting up a new development bank for mobilizing resources for infrastructure, and we are satisfied that the establishment of a new development bank is feasible and viable. We have agreed to establish the new development bank. We tasked our finance ministers and central bank governors to explore the construction of a financial safety net through the creation of a Contingent Reserve Arrangement, or CRA, amongst BRICS countries. We are of the view that the establishment of the CRA, with an initial size of $100 billion US, is feasible. We call for the reform of the international financial institutions to make them more representative and to reflect the growing weight of BRICS. We remain concerned with the slow pace of the reform of the IMF." The BRICS summit also specifically addressed the U.S. dollar's role as the world's leading reserve currency and its possible replacement by SDRs. "We support the reform and improvement of the international monetary system with a broad-based international reserve currency system providing stability and certainty. We welcome the discussion about the role of the SDR in the existing international monetary system, including the composition of the SDR's basket of currencies." Finally, and so as to leave no doubt about the BRICS status as a political rather than an economic project, the Durban summit devoted substantial time to topics such as the crisis in Syria, a Palestinian state, Israeli settlements, Iranian nuclear weapons development, the war in Afghanistan, instability in the Congo, and other purely geopolitical issues. The BRICS reaffirmed their commitment to their new multilateral lending facility at their summit in St. Petersburg on September 5, 2013, held in conjunction with the G20 Leaders Summit. At that summit, the BRICS agreed that their contributions to the new fund would come 41% from China, 18% each from Russia, Brazil, and India, and 5% from South Africa. In a surprising coda to the revelations of U.S. spying on allies emerging from defector Edward Snowden, Brazil announced plans in September 2013 to build a 20,000-mile undersea fiber optic cable network from Fortaleza, Brazil to Vladivostok, Russia, with links in Cape Town, South Africa, Chennai, India, and Shantou, China, to be completed by 2015. This system is tantamount to a BRICS internet, intended to be free from U.S. surveillance. The United States has long had excellent capability in tapping into undersea cables, so the actual security of the new system may be problematic. Nevertheless, the proprietary nature of this system could easily be adapted to include a BRICS interbank payment system, which would facilitate the use of any BRICS-sponsored alternatives to dollar payments. In addition to the regular meetings of BRICS leaders, a large number of ancillary and shadow institutions have sprung up around the BRICS, including the BRICS Think Tanks Council, the BRICS Business Council, and a BRICS Virtual Secretariat, among others. The BRICS are also coordinating foreign policy through the BRICS Foreign Affairs Ministers' meetings in conjunction with the annual UN General Assembly meeting in New York. These initiatives have spawned a new international facilitator class, the BRICS Sherpa, and their Sue Sherpas. These BRICS institutions form a formidable caucus in the midst of other multilateral forums conducted by the IMF, UN, and G20. Today, the BRICS must be regarded as a powerful economic and political force, notwithstanding a recent slowdown in growth rates in certain members, especially China. The global BRICS footprint in terms of territory, population, output, natural resources, and financial reserves is impossible to ignore. The world should anticipate a gradual convergence between the BRICS vision for the future and the West's legacy institutions, now that the BRICS have found policies and processes that unite them. This convergence has many facets, which can be condensed into a single theme: the diminution in the dollar's international role, and a decline in the ability of the United States and its closest allies to affect outcomes in major forums and in geopolitical disputes. The BRICS may have had humble origins in O'Neill's brief research paper, but the group has taken on a life of its own. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Wall Street analysts are not alone in identifying commonalities in emerging market economies, as other regional groups have come to the fore in recent years. These linkages, based upon regional proximity or community of interest, are beginning to challenge the post-war arrangements of the leading Western economies. They include the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, known as the SCO, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, known as GCC. Once again, these groupings share an inclination to reduce the U.S. dollar's role as the leading reserve currency. Their agendas go beyond the free trade areas and common markets found throughout the world and include strategic, military, natural resource, and international monetary initiatives. Depending on how well these groups pursue their agendas and overcome internal rivalries, they stand to play a significant role in any reformation or evolution of the international monetary system from its current configuration. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization was formed in June 2001 as a continuation of a predecessor organization, the Shanghai Five. The SCO members are the original Shanghai Five members: Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, plus new member Uzbekistan. However, the SCO includes India, Iran, and Pakistan among its observer states, and regularly invites the former Soviet republics and members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, to their meetings. The CSO had its origins in security issues indigenous to its member states, including suppression of secessionist tendencies in the Caucasus, Tibet, and Taiwan. The members also had a shared interest in defeating al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in Chechnya and western China. But SCO quickly evolved into an Asian counterweight to NATO. Russia gained China's support in its confrontation with NATO in Eastern Europe, and China gained the support of the Russians in its confrontation with the United States in East Asia. In this context, the SCO's rejection of a U.S. application for observer status in 2005 was unsurprising. In addition to conducting joint military exercises and cooperating in dozens of large-scale infrastructure projects related to energy, telecommunications, and water, the SCO has also launched initiatives in banking and multilateral finance, which are pertinent to the international monetary system's future. The Prime Minister's Council of the SCO signed an agreement at its Moscow summit on October 26, 2005, creating the SCO Interbank Consortium, designed to facilitate economic cooperation among its central banks, joint infrastructure financing, and formation of specialized development lenders to its members. At the SCO Prime Minister's Summit in Astana, Kazakhstan, in October 2008, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao and Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin endorsed Iran's application to become a full member of the SCO. At that summit, Iranian Vice President Parviz Davoudi remarked that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a good venue for designing a new banking system which is independent from international banking systems. The SCO summit in June 2009 was conducted side by side with the BRICS summit in Yekaterinburg, Russia. Hu Jintao and Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev used the occasion of the SCO and BRICS summits to sign a joint Sino-Russian declaration calling for reform of the global financial system and international financial institutions, and greater developing economy representation in the IMF. Newly elected Iranian President Hassan Rouhani had a kind of international coming-out party at the SCO summit in Kyrgyzstan's capital, Bishkek, on September 13, 2013. At the summit, Iran received strong support from Russia, China, and the rest of the SCO for non-interference in Iran's uranium enrichment efforts. As geopolitics are increasingly played out in the realm of international economics rather than purely military diplomatic spheres, the SCO's evolution from a security alliance to a potential monetary zone should be expected. This has already happened covertly through Russia and Chinese banks' role in facilitating Iranian hard currency transactions, despite sanctions on Iranian money transfers imposed by the United States and the EU. The convergence of the BRICS and SCO's agendas on international monetary matters should be most worrying for traditional Western allies. The drivers are Russia and China, the two most powerful members of both organizations. The BRICS and SCO may have separate agendas in military strategic affairs, but they are like-minded on the subjects of IMF voting rights, and they share an emerging antipathy to the dollar's dominant role. The Gulf. Another strategic and geographically contiguous alliance, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, genuinely has the potential to form a single currency area that would diminish the U.S. dollar's role. The GCC was founded on May 25, 1981, when Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates signed a pact in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. There have been no additions to this original group, although Morocco and Jordan are currently under consideration for membership. The GCC does not have links to Iraq or Iran, despite the fact that both of those nations border the Persian Gulf, along with all the GCC members. The reasons are obvious. Iraq ruined its GCC relations with the invasion of member Kuwait in 1990. Iran is not a candidate for membership because it is ethnically and religiously distinct from the Arab states with which it shares the Persian Gulf, and because it is Saudi Arabia's bitter enemy. But the possible additions of Jordan and Morocco make sense. The existing GCC members are all Arab monarchies. Jordan is an Arab monarchy, and Morocco is an Arabic-speaking monarchy and Arab League member. While the GCC pursues relatively liberal economic and trade policies, it is still a de facto club for the remaining kings of Arabia. The GCC has pursued a path not unlike the EU in that it successfully launched a common market in 2008 and is now moving toward a single currency. The GCC's significance for the international monetary system lies more in its single currency initiative than in any other facets of strategic or economic cooperation, which are of mostly regional rather than international importance. As was the case with the euro, implementation of a single currency in the GCC will take a decade or more to complete. Key issues that need to be resolved include convergence criteria for members' fiscal and monetary policies and the powers of the new central bank. Most vexing in the short run are the inevitable politics that swirl around issues such as the physical location of the central bank's headquarters and the membership and governance of its board. The GCC members are already in a quasi-currency union because their individual currencies are pegged to the US dollar, and therefore to one another using fixed exchange rates. However, each GCC member retains an independent central bank. This arrangement resembles the European rate mechanism, known as the ERM, which lasted from 1979 to 1999, and was a predecessor to the euro, although the GCC has had more success than the ERM, which witnessed numerous breaks with designated exchange rate parities by its members. The conversion from the current GCC arrangement to a single currency would appear to be a straightforward process, but recent stresses in the Eurozone have given pause to the GCC members and impeded the monetary integration process. The most prominent impediment is running a single monetary policy with divergent fiscal policies. This problem was one of the principal contributors to the European sovereign debt crisis. Countries such as Greece and Spain engaged in non-sustainable fiscal policies financed with debt issued in a strong currency, the euro, to investors who inferred, incorrectly, that euro-denominated sovereign debt had the implicit support of all the Eurozone members. The core problem for any proposed currency union, such as the GCC, is how to enforce fiscal discipline among members when there is a single central bank and a single monetary policy. The need is to prevent a recurrence of Greek-style free riding on the stronger members' fiscal discipline. The GCC has already witnessed this free riding problem in the 2009 Dubai World collapse. Dubai is part of the United Arab Emirates along with 6 other principalities, most prominently Abu Dhabi. The Emirates share a single currency, the dirham, issued by a central bank located in Abu Dhabi. Dubai World, an investment holding company, was created in 2006 by Dubai's ruler, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. Although Dubai World insisted its debts were not government guaranteed, its debt appeared to investors as tantamount to a UAE member's sovereign debt. Between 2006 and 2009, Dubai World borrowed approximately $60 billion to finance infrastructure projects, including office buildings, apartments, and transportation systems, many of which remain empty or underused to this day. On November 27, 2009, Dubai World unexpectedly announced it was requesting a standstill among creditors and called for debt maturity extensions across the board. This default, rather than any specific event in Europe, was the catalyst for the sovereign debt crisis that quickly engulfed Europe and lasted from 2010 to 2012. Eventually, Abu Dhabi and the UAE Central Bank intervened to bail out Dubai World in much the same manner as the EU and the European Central Bank intervened to bail out Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain. These lessons from the UAE and Europe are not lost on Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the other wealthy GCC members. An enforceable GCC fiscal pact with limits on deficit spending is likely to be required before the single currency project moves forward. The other major issue looming over the GCC single currency is the question of an initial par value relative to the US dollar. Too low a value would be inflationary, while too high a value would prove deflationary. This is the same dilemma that confronted the UK when it returned to the gold standard in 1925, after suspending it in 1914 to fight the First World War. The UK blundered then by setting sterling's value against gold too high, which caused extreme deflation and contributed to the Great Depression. When a country or group of countries peg to the US dollar, those countries effectively outsource their monetary policy to the Federal Reserve. If the Fed is engaged in monetary ease and the pegging country is running a trade surplus or experiencing capital inflows, the pegging country has to print its own money to purchase the incoming dollars in order to maintain the peg. In effect, the Fed's easy money policy is exported through the exchange rate mechanism, which forces the pegging country to engage in its own easy money policy. If the pegging country economy is stronger than the U.S. economy, this easy money policy will produce inflation, as has occurred in China and the GCC since 2008. The simplest solution is to abandon the peg and allow the local currency to appreciate against the dollar. Such reductions in the dollar's value are the Fed's goal under its cheap dollar policy. An alternative solution is to maintain a single currency with a value fixed to a currency other than the dollar. Monetary experts have suggested several candidates for an alternative peg. One obvious candidate is the IMF's Special Drawing Right, the SDR. The SDR itself is valued relative to a currency basket that includes the dollar but with significant weight given to the euro, sterling, and the yen. Importantly, the IMF retains the ability to change the SDR basket composition periodically, adding new currencies to better reflect trade patterns, changes in comparative advantage, and the relative economic performance of the countries whose currencies are included in the basket. An SDR peg would align the future GCC currency more closely with the economies of its trading partners and decrease the Fed's impact on GCC monetary policy. GCC member economies are highly dependent on oil exports for revenue and growth. Volatility in the dollar price of oil translates into volatility in economic performance when the GCC currency is pegged to the dollar. A logical extension, then, of the SDR basket approach would be to include the dollar price of oil in the basket. By doing so, the exchange value of the GCC currency would move in tandem with the dollar price of oil. If the Fed pursued a cheap dollar policy and the dollar price of oil increased due to the resulting inflation, the GCC currency would appreciate automatically, mitigating inflation in the GCC. This way, the GCC currency can be both pegged and free of the Fed's cheap dollar policy. A more intriguing solution to the peg issue, and one with large implications for the future of the international monetary system, is more radical: to price oil and natural gas exports in the GCC currency itself, thereby allowing the GCC currency to float relative to other currencies. This could truly mark the beginning of the dollar's demise as the benchmark currency for oil prices, and it would create immediate global demand for the GCC currency. This trend toward the abandonment of the dollar as the benchmark for pricing oil was dramatically accelerated in late 2013 as a result of White House efforts to legitimize Iran as the regional hegemon of the Middle East. Implicitly since 1945 and explicitly since 1974, the United States has guaranteed Saudi Arabia's security in exchange for Saudi support for the dollar as the sole medium of exchange for energy exports and for Saudi promises to purchase weapons and infrastructure from the United States. This nearly 70-year-long relationship was thrown into grave doubt in late 2013 by President Obama's modus vivendi with Iran and implicit tolerance of Iranian nuclear ambitions. The U.S.-Iranian rapprochement occurred after Saudi-U.S. relations had already been badly strained by President Obama's abandonment of Saudi ally Hosni Mubarak in Egypt in 2011 during the Arab Spring uprisings, and by the president's failure to support Saudi rebel allies in the Syrian civil war. The Saudis then spent billions of dollars to help restore military rule in Egypt and to crush the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood favored by President Obama. More recently, the Saudis publicly displayed their displeasure with the United States and moved decisively to secure weapons from Russia, nuclear technology from Pakistan, and security assistance from Israel. The resulting Saudi-Russian-Egyptian alliance removes another prop from under the dollar and creates a community of interest between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which had already announced its preference for an international monetary system free from dollar hegemony. For a GCC currency to become a true global reserve currency, as opposed to a trade currency, further deepening of the GCC financial markets and infrastructure would be needed. However, Saudi Arabia's reevaluation of its security relations with the United States, combined with the euro's expansion and the efforts of the BRICS and the SCO to acquire gold and escape dollar dominance, could presage a quite rapid diminution in the dollar's international reserve currency role. The Island Twins. Two nations stand apart from this survey of monetary multilateralism and rising discontent with the international monetary system: the UK and Japan. The UK is a member of NATO and the EU, while Japan is an important and long-standing treaty ally of the United States. Neither nation has joined in a monetary union nor spoken out vociferously against U.S. dominance in international monetary institutions. Both Japan and the UK maintain their own currencies and their own central banks. They host the respective financial centers of Tokyo and London. The Japanese yen and the UK pound sterling are both officially recognized as reserve currencies by the IMF, and both Japan and the UK have the large, robust bond markets needed to support that designation. Still, Japan and the UK are weak in gold reserves, with only about 25% of the gold needed to equal the United States or Russia in a gold-to-GDP ratio. Japan and the UK have an even lower gold-to-GDP ratio than China, which is itself short of gold. The United States, the Eurozone, and Russia all have sufficient gold to sustain confidence in their currencies in the event of a crisis. In contrast, Japan and the UK represent the purest cases of reliance on fiat money. Both countries are out on a limb, with printing presses, insufficient gold, no monetary allies, and no Plan B. Japan and the UK are part of a global monetary experiment orchestrated by the U.S. Federal Reserve and articulated by former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke in two speeches, one given in Tokyo on October 14, 2012, and one given in London on March 25, 2013. In his 2012 Tokyo speech, Bernanke stated that the United States would continue its loose monetary policy through quantitative easing for the foreseeable future. Trading partners therefore had two choices. They could peg their currencies to the dollar, which would cause inflation, exactly what the GCC was experiencing. Or, according to Bernanke, those trading partners could allow their currencies to appreciate, the desired outcome under his cheap dollar policy, in which case their exports would suffer. For trading partners that complained that this was a Hobson's choice between inflation and reduced exports, Bernanke explained that if the Fed did not ease, the result would be even worse for them: a collapsing U.S. economy that would hurt world demand as well as world trade, and sink developed and emerging markets into a global depression. Despite Bernanke's rationale, his cheap dollar policy had the potential to ignite beggar-thy-neighbor rounds of currency devaluations, a currency war that could lead to a trade war, as happened in the 1930s. Bernanke addressed this concern in his 2013 London speech. One problem with the 1930s devaluations, he said, was that they were sequential rather than contemporaneous. Each country that devalued in the 1930s might have gained growth or export market share, but it came at the expense of the countries that had not devalued. The desired growth from devaluation was suboptimal because it came with high costs. Bernanke's solution was for simultaneous, rather than sequential ease by the United States, Japan, the UK, and the ECB. In theory, this would produce stimulus in the major economies without imposing temporary costs on trading partners. He went on to say, "Today, most advanced industrial economies remain in the grip of slow recoveries from the Great Recession. With inflation generally contained, central banks in these countries are providing accommodative monetary policies to support growth. Do these policies constitute competitive devaluations? To the contrary, because monetary policy is accommodative in the great majority of advanced industrial economies, one would not expect large and persistent changes in exchange rates among these countries. The benefits of monetary accommodation in the advanced economies are not created in any significant way by changes in exchange rates. They come instead from the support of domestic aggregate demand in each country or region. Moreover, because stronger growth in each economy confers beneficial spillovers to trading partners, these policies are not beggar thy neighbor, but rather are positive-sum enrich thy neighbor actions." Bernanke's enrich thy neighbor rhetoric ignored the neighbors in emerging markets. such as China, Korea, Brazil, Thailand, and elsewhere, whose currencies would have to appreciate and their exports suffer in order for Bernanke's stimulus to work in the developed economies. In other words, Japanese exports might benefit, but this could come at the expense of Korea's exports, and so on. It might not be a currency war of all against all, but it was still one that pitted the United States, the UK, and Japan against the remaining G20 members. Japan and the UK had another reason to support the money printing and resultant devaluation being urged by the Fed. Money printing was being done not only to promote exports, but to increase import prices. These more expensive imports would cause inflation to offset deflation, which was a danger to the United States and the UK, and had long existed in Japan. In Japan's case, inflation would come primarily through higher prices for energy imports, and in the cases of the United States and the UK, it would come from higher prices for clothing, electronics, and certain raw materials and foodstuffs. The United States and the UK both have debt-to-GDP ratios of approximately 100% and rising, while Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is over 220%. These levels are historically high. The trend in these ratios is more important to investors than the absolute levels, and the trend is worsening. All three nations are moving toward a sovereign debt crisis if their policies cannot be adjusted to put these debt-to-GDP ratios on a declining path. Debt-to-GDP ratios are calculated in nominal rather than real terms. Nominal debt needs to be repaid with nominal growth in income. Nominal growth equals real growth plus inflation. Since real growth is anemic, the central banks must cause inflation to have any hope of increasing nominal growth and reducing these debt-to-GDP ratios. When policy interest rate cuts are no longer possible because the rates are effectively zero, quantitative easing, designed in part to import inflation through currency devaluation, is the central banker's preferred technique. The Bank of England, the BOE, has engaged in 4 rounds of quantitative easing, known as QE, beginning in March 2009. Subsequent rounds were launched in October 2011, February 2012, and July 2012. Increased asset purchases have ceased for the time being, but the BOE's near-zero interest rate policy has continued. The BOE is refreshingly candid about the fact that it is targeting nominal rather than real growth, although it hopes that real growth might be a byproduct. Its official explanation on the bond purchases to carry out QE states, "The purpose of the purchases was and is to inject money directly into the economy in order to boost nominal demand. Despite this different means of implementing monetary policy, the objective remains unchanged, to meet the inflation target of 2% on the CPI measure of consumer prices." The situation in Japan differs. Japan has been in what may be described as a long depression since December 1989, when the 1980s stock and property bubbles collapsed. Japan relied primarily on fiscal stimulus through the 1990s to keep its economy afloat, but a more pernicious phase of the depression began in the late 1990s. Japan's nominal GDP peaked in 1997, declining almost 12% by 2011. The Japanese Consumer Price Index peaked in 1998 and has declined steadily since, with relatively few quarters of positive CPI readings. It is a truism, if not intuitive, that an economy with declining nominal GDP can still have real growth when inflation turns to deflation. But this type of real growth does nothing to help the government with debt, deficits, and tax collections, since those functions are based on nominal growth. The Bank of Japan's, known as BOJ, relationship to QE, inflation, and nominal GDP targeting is more opaque than the Bank of England's. The BOJ's efforts at monetary ease prior to 2001 were desultory and controversial even within the BOJ. A modest QE program was begun in March 2001, but was too small to have much effect. A detailed IMF survey of the impact of QE in Japan from 2001 to 2011 concluded the impact on economic activity was found to be limited. Suddenly, on December 16, 2012, Japanese politics and monetary policy were transformed with Shinzo Abe's election as prime minister and a landslide victory for his Liberal Democratic Party. The election gave Abe's party a supermajority in the Japanese Diet that could override vetoes by the Senate. Abe campaigned explicitly on a platform of money printing, including threats to amend the laws governing the Bank of Japan if it failed to print. "It's very rare for monetary policy to be the focus of an election," Abe said. "We campaigned on the need to beat deflation, and our argument has won strong support. I hope the Bank of Japan accepts the results and takes an appropriate decision." Even Abe's election did not fully convince markets that the BOJ would actually take extraordinary measures, given the bank's indifferent approach to monetary ease for the prior 20 years. On March 20, 2013, Abe's hand-picked candidate, Haruhiko Kuroda, became governor of the BOJ. Within days, Kuroda persuaded the BOJ's policy board to implement the largest quantitative easing program the world had ever seen. The BOJ pledged to purchase $1.4 trillion of Japanese government bonds over the 2-year period of 2013 and 2014 using printed money. Japan simultaneously announced a plan to lengthen the maturity structure of the bonds it purchased, comparable to the Fed's Operation Twist. Relative to the size of the U.S. economy, Japan's money printing program was more than twice as large as the Fed's QE3 program, announced in 2012. As was the case with the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan was explicit about its goal to increase inflation in order to increase nominal, if not real, GDP. The board said, "The bank will achieve the target of 2% in terms of the year-on-year rate of change in the Consumer Price Index at the earliest possible time." By 2014, it was as if the Federal Reserve, the BOJ, and the BOE were in a monetary poker game and had gone all in on their bet. All three central banks had used money printing and near-zero rates to create inflation in order to increase nominal GDP. Whether nominal GDP turned into real GDP was beside the point. In fact, real growth since 2009 was on a path characteristic of depression in all three countries. Inflation and nominal GDP were the explicit and primary goals of their respective monetary policies. The US dollar, the UK pound sterling, and the Japanese yen together comprise 70% of global allocated reserves and 65% of the SDR basket. If the Federal Reserve is the keystone of the international monetary system, the Bank of Japan and the Bank of England are adjacent archstones. But all three central banks, now engaged in a monetary experiment on an unprecedented scale, face highly uncertain outcomes. Their announced goal is not real growth, but inflation, and nominal growth in order to pay their debts. Creditors and reserve holders in the BRICS, the SCO, the GCC, and other emerging markets are watching this money-printing pageant with undisguised frustration and increasing determination to end an international monetary system that allows such economic free-riding at the cost of inflation, lost exports, and diminished wealth in their own countries. It remains to be seen whether the international monetary system collapses of its own weight or is overthrown by emerging market losers in response to this crime of the century being perpetrated by the US, UK, and Japanese central banks.